The Haunted Hunt. The fog hung thick over the dense woods as the hunting team made their way silently through the trees, each step softened by layers of fallen leaves and damp moss. It was a moonless night, the kind that seemed to steal every bit of light from the world, making the flashlights in their hands feel feeble and insignificant. Mark, the leader of the team, was certain they were close to their target, a big buck they had tracked for weeks. But as they pressed deeper into the forest, a strange feeling settled over the group, a sense of being watched. The others felt it too. Jason, the quietest of them, glanced nervously around, as if trying to spot the unseen eyes he felt on him. Ethan, usually the jokester, was uncharacteristically silent, his mouth set in a grim line. The snap of the twig to their left made them freeze. They scanned the darkness, guns raised, but all they could see was the dense wall of trees and fog. "Did anyone else hear that?" whispered Rachel, her voice shaky. "Probably just an animal," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Stay sharp." They continued, slower, their senses heightened. But the further they walked, the heavier the air seemed to get, as if the fog was pressing down on them, filling their lungs with a metallic taste. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jason saw movement. He whipped his flashlight in that direction, catching a glimpse of something white drifting between the trees. For a moment, he thought it was a deer, but as it moved closer, he realized it had the shape of a human, a woman, wearing a long, flowing gown, her face blank and featureless. "Did you guys see that?" he stammered, pointing. Mark turned his flashlight to where Jason was pointing, but there was nothing. Just the dark stretch of forest and the low hum of the night. "Cut it out, Jason. You're seeing things," Mark said, a hint of irritation in his voice. But then, Rachel screamed. All flashlights spun to her, illuminating her pale, horrified face as she stared at something behind the group. Slowly, they turned, their lights casting long, trembling shadows. There, just beyond the reach of their beams, stood several figures, all dressed in tattered, decaying clothes. Their skin was ashen, their eyes hollow and black, voids in their sunken faces. They stood still, watching the hunters with an intensity that chilled the blood. One of the figures took a slow, gliding step forward, followed by another, and then another, each movement soundless but deliberate. The hunters raised their guns, their hands shook as they pointed at the approaching specters. Mark swallowed hard. Back up. Slowly. They began to retreat, but no matter how far they went, the figures followed, closing the gap with eerie silence. The further they moved, the more spirits seemed to materialize from the fog. Men, women, children, all with vacant stares and clothes from another time, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. Rachel whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. They're following us." Ethan couldn't take it any longer. He turned and ran, stumbling over roots and stones, his flashlight bouncing wildly. The others, too terrified to think, bolted after him. But the spirits gave chase, gliding effortlessly through the underbrush, their eyes locked on the terrified hunters. One by one, their flashlights began to flicker, the batteries inexplicably drained. In the darkness, the hunters could only hear the faint, dragging sound of feet behind them, growing closer and closer. Then came the whispers, low and mournful, unintelligible words filling the air like a dark chant, the voices of the dead pleading, accusing, calling out. Jason tripped, falling face first into the mud. He scrambled to his feet, but when he looked up, he found himself surrounded. The spirits had encircled him, their faces inches from his, their cold, dead breath seeping into his skin. trees, and Jason was nowhere to be seen. They never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, when they were alone, they could still hear faint whispers on the wind, calling them back into the woods, reminding them of the souls they had encountered on that dark, moonless hunt, a hunt that left them forever haunted. The Wolves of Blackwood Forest. The wind howled through the trees as the hunting team trudged deeper into Blackwood Forest. The night was unnaturally dark, the dense canopy above smothering even the faintest glimmer of moonlight. It was supposed to be a routine hunt, just a chance to track down some deer before the season ended. But as they moved through the twisted trees, a thick fog rolled in, turning the world into a disorienting maze. Dan, the leader of the group, stopped suddenly, raising his hand to signal the others. Behind him, Liam, Garrett, and Mia came to an uneasy halt, straining to see through the mist. "Something's wrong," Mia whispered. She wasn't usually one to scare easily, but tonight, everything was off. The forest was too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive weight of the fog and the faint crunch of their own footsteps. "Keep moving," Dan replied, trying to sound confident. "Let's get out of here." They pressed on, but as they walked, an eerie growl echoed through the woods. Garrett froze, gripping his rifle tighter. "Anyone else hear that?" he whispered. Liam scoffed. But as he said it, another growl joined the first, then another. Soon they could hear multiple low, menacing growls surrounding them, closing in from all directions. The first pair of eyes appeared in the mist, a pair of golden orbs watching them from the darkness. Then more eyes flickered to life, gleaming and hungry, encircling them. "Wolves," Dan muttered, his voice low but tense. "Stand back to back. Don't let them get close." The group moved into formation, their breaths quick and shallow as they scanned the darkness. The wolves didn't charge. Instead, they crept forward, their bodies low to the ground, their teeth bared in silent snarls. These weren't ordinary wolves. They were larger, their fur dark and ragged, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Why aren't they attacking?" Mia whispered, trying to keep her gun steady. One of the wolves, larger than the others, took a step forward. It was nearly the size of a bear, its jaws gaping wide as it let out a bone-chilling howl. The rest of the wolves joined in, their howls filling the air with an ominous chorus that reverberated through the forest. Dan lifted his gun and fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare them off, but the wolves didn't flinch. Instead, they seemed almost amused, their eyes narrowing, their muscles coiling tighter, ready to spring. "Run!" Dan shouted, breaking their formation. The team scattered, bolting through the trees in different directions. Mia could hear the thundering footsteps of wolves behind her as she ran, weaving through the trees, her heart pounding. But no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps kept pace, the wolves closing in on her, their growls echoing in her ears. She stumbled, falling into the mud, and turned just in time to see one of the wolves lunging at her. She screamed, but her cries were drowned out by the snarling, snapping jaws. Elsewhere, Liam was running blindly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He heard Garrett scream somewhere in the distance, a brief, desperate sound that cut off abruptly. Liam's hands shook as he aimed his rifle and fired into the darkness, but the shot went wide. Then he felt a sharp pain in his leg, teeth sinking into his flesh. He fell, kicking and thrashing, but the wolves were relentless, tearing into him with merciless precision. Dan, the last one standing, sprinted until his lungs burned, but he could hear the pack behind him, their growls growing louder, their eyes piercing through the mist like tiny, cruel lanterns. dropped. The wolves were already there, waiting for him. The leader of the pack stepped forward, its eyes locked onto Dan's, intelligent and malevolent. He raised his rifle with trembling hands, but the wolf lunged before he could pull the trigger. It sank its teeth into his arm, and the rifle fell, clattering uselessly to the ground. He screamed, thrashing in a desperate attempt, but the rest of the pack descended on him, their teeth and claws tearing through his flesh. His screams echoed through the forest, then faded, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the wet, tearing sounds as the wolves feasted. The fog swallowed the forest again, and the woods fell silent, as if nothing had happened. By morning, there would be no trace of the hunters, only a few scattered pieces of gear and the faint scent of blood lingering in the air. The wolves had returned to the shadows, waiting, as they always did, for the next group foolish enough to wander into Blackwood Forest on a moonless night.